Hello, and welcome to the 12th in this series of programs about foundational concepts in economics. What we're looking at here is the idea that knowledge has a cost. A key insight for economics, in fact, is that knowledge is costly to acquire. This is something that is very easy to overlook. It's very easy to think or assume that actually knowledge is something free, that data, information is something that's just floating around there. But in fact, this is not the case and has never been the case. And it's important, this insight, because it is knowledge that informs decisions and the actions and choices of individuals in economics and indeed in other aspects of human life. If you don't have information, as we shall see, decision-making becomes much more difficult. And so knowledge plays a hugely important part in the whole process of economic decision-making, trade and exchange, and all of the other actions that economists look with. Now, what does it mean, really, to say that knowledge is costly to acquire, that information or data is not free? What it means quite simply is this. It takes time, effort, expenditure of resources to get knowledge, and also, very importantly, to confirm its accuracy, because you may think you know something, but how sure are you? In order to make the certainty that you have about a certain piece of knowledge reach an acceptable level, you also have to expend effort and time and resources. And so what that means is that information is not simply something that is lying around like sand on a beach. It's something that actually has a cost in the sense of an opportunity cost. The resources and the time that it takes to get the knowledge, to confirm it or to make it more certain and reliable are all resources and time that you could have spent doing something else. And therefore, by definition, it's costly. Now, what you find is that very often information is too costly to get for it to yield any likely benefit. You find that the amount of effort you would have to put in, the amount of time you would have to spend to find something out is simply far too great for any benefit that you would get from having that information and therefore it informing the decision you make to pay off. Now, if that is the situation, which happens very often, in fact, in life, more often than you might imagine, although if you think about it, you'll doubtless be able to come up with lots of everyday examples, what do you do? Now, the simplest solution, the simplest answer is actually to do nothing. Very often, this is the wisest course of action. If you are in a condition of ignorance, if it's too costly for you to find out the critical information about the choice that you have to make, if you can do it, simply doing nothing is probably the wisest thing to do, because that way you will not incur the costs of a mistaken action. You will simply keep what you already have, so to speak. And it's worth emphasizing this because a lot of contemporary thinking tends to say that you should always do something rather than nothing. In fact, that's dangerous advice. In many cases, don't do something, just stand there is actually the best advice you can get because you are more likely to cause costs and not bring any benefit than you are to bring a benefit around. And so sitting still is actually the best advice. But sometimes, of course, obviously, you can't do that. You're very often in a situation where simply doing nothing is not an option because you know that that in itself would bring serious costs to bear upon you. And so regardless of the fact that you have either no information or radically impaired information, you still have to make decisions. You still have to do something. Now, what that means is that in that case, you are having to make a decision under conditions of imperfect information, as it's called. This is something that soldiers are very familiar with, for example. One of the things that pretty much any textbook of military affairs will tell you is that once you're in actual combat, when you're in the actual situation of war, you have to make all your decisions on the basis of radically imperfect information. You very often have no idea or a very imperfect or out-of-date idea about what is actually going on. This is what is colloquially referred to as the fog of war, the state of imperfect knowledge that generals have to operate under. And so there is a whole branch of military science concerned with how you make decisions of this kind. But this isn't only a phenomenon confined to warfare and the military. The same is true for people who are running a business, for example. Very often you don't know what your competitors are doing. you do not have knowledge about what the state of the market is, what likely events are going on, and it would be way too costly for you to acquire this, but you've still got to do something. And it also applies at a personal level. Very often you have to make decisions such as whether to make a trip, for example, when it would be simply too costly for you to find out what the weather is likely to be, or you might not even be able to do that. And that's just one very small, trivial example. So it's important to realize that this is actually the normal state of affairs. Because of the cost of acquiring knowledge, most decisions are taken under conditions of imperfect knowledge. It's very unusual, in fact, that you can make a decision knowing what situation you're facing and having that knowledge be reliable enough and certain enough for you to be fully 100% confident in it. And so the cost of knowledge means that imperfect knowledge decision making is what most people are doing most of the time. So confronted with that kind of situation, what do you do? Well, one of the things you can do is rely upon the price mechanism. One of the important features of the price mechanism, of the prices generated by the free interplay of buyers and sellers in a marketplace, is that it does reduce the cost of acquiring knowledge. And therefore, it means that even though acquiring knowledge is still costly, you've still got a better chance of finding out roughly what things are or where they're going. Another is that you need to find a way of somehow evaluating or assigning probabilities to the imperfect knowledge that you do have. In other words, you may say, well, I think that X is the case, but that by itself isn't enough. What you need to be able to do, if you can, is to say, well, I think there is a certain probability that X is the case. Maybe there's a 1 in 3 chance that X is the case. Then, with that probability assigned to the imperfect information, you can make a better judgment, a more informed judgment. Now, how do you do that? Well, again, there are various market mechanisms that enable you to do this. Competitive insurance markets, for example, exist mainly to assign probabilities to various outcomes and therefore make imperfect, uncertain information more reliable and more effective. Gambling and gambling markets where bets are bought and sold, such as Betfair, are actually an extremely good way of finding out what the probabilities of certain events happening actually are. There is one important qualification to that, which is that you don't want a betting market in which a small number of people are placing very, very large bets, because that will distort the odds. What you want is a betting market where there are lots and lots of imperfect bettors, small bettors, if you will, and that will tend to yield better judgments about probabilities. It's worth saying betting markets have a better record of predicting the future than pretty much any other kind of source, including expert pundits. So that's one of the ways in which you can deal with it. Another way of dealing with imperfect information is to use what are called heuristics or rules of thumb. These are extrapolations from past experience. What you say is that usually when X has been the case, Y has happened. As I say, it's not a certain prediction, it's a rule of thumb. Heuristics are very, very important as guides to decision making under conditions of costly knowledge acquisition, because it's a shortcut. It's a way of not having to give out the cost of actually acquiring the knowledge or of making it more certain. You simply rely upon the rule of thumb to guide you in the future. The problem, of course, is that this relies upon what's called inductive reasoning. What you're doing is looking at the way things have happened in the past and saying that because they generally happened this way in the past, therefore they're probably going to happen the same way in the future. Now, sometimes this is a very powerful predictor. You can be pretty certain the sun is going to rise in the east tomorrow. But on the other hand, in many cases, it's not. And just because something has always worked out a certain way in the past does not logically and necessarily mean that it's going to work out the same way in the future. This time it could be different. So heuristics are very, very important as a way of dealing with the cost of getting knowledge, but they're not a perfect solution. In fact, there is no truly perfect solution. Finally, the final way of dealing with the cost of getting knowledge is to do what in the equivalent of what in the television quiz show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire is asking the audience. What you do is use a mechanism of some kind to get the guesses of a very large number of people. This makes use of what's called the wisdom of crowds effect, which was first identified in the 19th century by the polymath Sir Francis Galton. What Galton noticed when he was at an agricultural fair was that there were a lot of people taking part in a competition to guess the weight of a pig. The one who got closest was the one who actually won the pig as the prize. You might think a booby prize. He was very amused by how wildly varied the guesses were and how inaccurate most of them were. But he discovered that if you added up all of these ignorant, uninformed guesses and averaged them out, the average was almost perfectly correct. And this is what you often find, that blind guesses by people who are ignorant, when they're aggregated, put together in some way, actually yield a fairly accurate answer. And that is how insurance markets and the other kind of markets I mentioned actually work. And so what you also rely upon to get around the cost of acquiring knowledge is to simply ask lots and lots of relatively ignorant people what their best guess is, and then you aggregate and put together those guesses, and that gives you a rough yardstick by which you can then decide what to do. It's worth saying that actually the more experts there are in the pool of people you ask, the less accurate the overall guess is. So in this case, ignorance really is bliss. Finally, reducing the cost of acquiring information is one of the most important ways that you can increase economic activity and therefore economic well-being and wealth. One of the big events in human history was the invention of the telegraph. That's because this was an invention that enormously reduced the cost of acquiring knowledge and information about things that were going on a long way away from where you were. And this made all kinds of trade and economic activity possible that was not possible before, because the cost of acquiring knowledge about, for example, the price of goods in distant markets was simply too high. And so there was a kind of quantum leap, if you like, in human beings' ability to acquire information, or to put it another way, there was a quantum reduction in the cost of acquiring knowledge in the middle of the 19th century when the telegraph was invented, and that was what lay behind a lot of the huge increase in wealth that took place in the rest of that century and has continued to take place since. And so, if you want to improve human well-being, one of the most certain ways that you can do that is by reducing the cost of acquiring knowledge.